Hi everybody, this is week 5 from the January Let's Play 2025. It's a bonus week. You still have this week to work on your block. But saying that, I also want to say, if you're loving this idea and you want to work on these blocks, but the pace is too fast for you because your life is busy, feel free to take it as slow as you want to. I'm leaving all the videos and the web pages online, so you will be able to see it a month from now and 6 months from now. So just take your time. You do not have to do a block of the month. If you don't want to, you can do a block in 6 months if that's what it takes you to do. I just want you to enjoy the sewing. Now, I've got a bunch of silly little tips for you for this week, and let's get at it. One of the things I wanted to cover in this bonus episode was the different ways I finished the different edges of my 2 blocks so far, to give you an idea of how you might want to finish yours. I mean, you could put regular quilt binding, a skinny version of it on. That would totally be fine. Actually, that would look lovely. There's scrappy ways you could do it and everything. Each one of mine, except for here, had blanket stitching involved, which is one of my favorite embroidery stitches. It just finishes an edge really nice. But so I'm going to give you some up close ideas, okay? On the top of here, I did the flip over faux binding thing like I did here. But on this particular one, I did the blanket stitching across, and on each time I carried the thread over, I put a bead on so that you get the whole beaded effect. Now along this side, I just did straight up blanket stitching, pretty even. And along the bottom on that trim that no, it's not bias, it was a trim. I did the blanket stitching on the bottom, a smaller version of it, and then on top I did the running stitch. So on the back, it's just the blanket stitch showing, okay? And then on this side, I put the trim, this crochet trim, I'm not really sure what it's called, sorry. And I did the blanket stitching when I attached it too. So on the bottom edge, I blanket stitched it all the way across, and then along the top, I stitched it down so that it would just really be down. Now, this trim, I did the same kind of blanket stitching on the edge, but I also did a second row blanket stitching inside before I added the beaded hearts. I knew when I put this one down it was going to always be turning just that slight little bit and be slightly annoying. Oh well. Now here's a trim version again, and again blanket stitched it down and then did stitching on the top to hold it down. And on this trim it was the same thing. It was just trickier, as I mentioned before. It was so wonky when I was holding it down and basting it, but it all came together lovely once I added the stitching across the top through the different loops. It just straightened itself out. And then on this one, it's sort of that faux binding again, where I just folded an 1.25 inch fabric in half, and then each raw edge towards the center, and then the only thing I did to put it down was this running stitch that goes from front to back. It's otherwise loose, but on the very ends I did do some whip stitching so that it holds it together. And here I did some blind stitching to attach the two. All right, I hope that gives you some ideas on how you can finish your edges. Because I'm rarely, I might, but at the moment I'm really not planning on quilting any of the background pieces. Sometimes puffiness happens, and there is a way to counter that I discovered when stitching this one. What I did is, if for example there was, where did I have the best result with that? Well, even under here, whatever was puffy here, as I was stitching this, I would pull the fabric and tuck it under and hold it with my left thumb when I took the next stitch. Same as here along the edge. I would just lightly with my needle pull the fabric slightly until it got tucked under whatever I was stitching. Then I held it with my left hand and took a couple stitches and then repeated. And that smoothed it out. Like here you can see it's quite smooth, where I didn't do it so much here, and it's a little slightly puffier. It's the puffy's fine, but that's a way you can keep the puffiness down if that's something you feel like doing. In doing this method, there's going to be times you're going to be stitching through a lot of layers, and in that, like, stitching 2 or 3 stitches on your needle at a time does not work. You won't catch enough fabric. And also, this is slow stitching. You don't need to do it fast. So my suggestion is to just stab stitch 1 stitch at a time. So you go down with your needle and pull it through, and then come up exactly where the nice thing about stab stitching, you come up exactly where you want to come up. So your stitches are as even and nice as you want them to be. So don't be afraid to stab stitch. It only takes slightly longer to do it that way. One of the things that can happen when you're stitching is your thread gets twisted and twisted, and it eventually can start to knot, which is not something you want to do. So in that case, when you start seeing that it's all curly, 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 hold the thread at as close to your piece as possible, and then dangle your needle, and it'll untwist on you. And then when you go to start stitching again, you've got a just straight thread to work with. That's so helpful. Here's the basket of threads and embroidery floss and pearl cotton that I use to do my brown and red piece. And I like to keep the project's threads all together like this so that I can just grab what I need. One thing, I don't love to waste thread. So whenever you know how there's those little pieces, they're usable, but you know, they're 6 inches, or they're not full pieces. What I end up doing with them, I do a couple different things. On my embroidery floss on the cards, I just take that loose piece and put it in the cut piece like that. And when my project is completely done, if I still want to save that piece, I wind it and then stick it through again and put it back in my drawer where I keep these. So that's one. For embroidery floss, that's what I do. For threads, I do the same thing, but I do it in the ridges they give you already for that kind of thing. And if you have a spool that doesn't have any of the ridges, I do 2 things. I either put the thread through the spool and just leave it in the center of it, or I have in the past gotten an X-Acto knife, one of those cutting knives that toolboxes usually have, and I cut a small slit in the plastic, and I make my own little ridge. And yeah, and then for the pearl cotton, I just shoved it back in the hole of the pearl cotton. It's just a way to keep the thread that you still have a piece of that you might use for something else. And I've used lots of those little pieces in this project, so it actually is something that saved me from pulling out a new big piece of thread. But it keeps it in the spool or together with the color that it belongs to, so you don't have to go looking through it to decide. And then, and this is a silly little tip, but it's the way I'm doing it, I baste a lot, as I've said, and when you take basting thread out, it's mostly, until you've used it a couple times, perfectly fine. And I hate to just waste that. It's a waste to throw these just in my cat pillow bucket. So this is a little pouch I had since I was a little girl, and it's supposed to take jewelry when you travel. I don't travel and I don't have jewelry. But what I did is, again, with the saving the basting thread is one thing, but then I've got this clump of white thread that what's it going to do me when I need a short piece as opposed to a long piece. So what I ended up doing, and this is the silly part, I have them in basic different sizes, the maybe the 3-inch one, the 4-inch one, the 6, the 8, and I don't have any in the other one. But so when I need like a good sized piece, I know to grab one from this little pouch and I don't have to go through the pile. That's a silly little tip, I know, but that's just me. I'm just going to describe this tip because I don't have the actual, I'm not going to make it up just to show it to you. But when I was sewing my project, I ended up getting a knot, like, you know, this far from where the project was, and it was one of those that I just couldn't pull through to the back to end it off. But what I did is I threaded the thread on a fatter needle. I guess I could show you that. So a needle that had a bigger eye, like quite a bigger eye. There. So I threaded it on there and used the bigger needle with the bigger eye to pull it through, and the big fat needle made room for the knot to get pulled to the back, and that was great. Then I could just tie it off on the back and bury it, and it worked out really well, and it wasn't going to make me take out a bunch of stitches just so I could get it to the back to tie it off. So that one was fun. When you're deciding when you're trying to decide what you want your background to do, when you don't really know what your project is going to look like because you haven't worked through all the steps, a lot of times, or you can, overthink it and worry about it too much. I want to stress again about just getting to that feeling of joy that you feel when you see something over something else, and just decide that way, just almost quickly, like which is better, this way or this way, and don't think about it torturously for any good length of time. Go with your instinct and you'll be right. If it's stressing you out to decide the spacing between, you want to get it really like looking exact, there's that button again. You want to get it really exact, or even the spacing of anything, there is no rule that you can't take a ruler and a chalk mark pencil and put in some marks for yourself. It doesn't have to be exact either, but if you like it to be a little closer to exact, then use marking tools. That's totally allowed. I wouldn't suggest anything that you have to iron out or use heat to remove, but a chalk pencil is fine to use. It usually brushes away. Here's another tip I'll have to just describe to you. When I bury my knots between the layers, one thing I've learned a couple of times this month is when you do that, you have to be aware of where that knot is, or as I did, you can stitch through it and then you kind of get this mess that happens because it comes through. And I did have that happen, like I said, a couple of times. But what saved me is I came up with an idea. It's almost impossible to shove that knot back because it has very little tail, and it's really hard to deal with. But what I ended up doing is I wrapped the knot a couple of times, just one wrap around, so it had a complete wrap of some basting thread, and then I threaded the ends of that basting thread into a needle, and I used that needle to go into like the same way you bury a knot. You go in and then you come out a little further along, and I did that, and the fact that basting thread was wrapped around the knot, it pulled the knot through to the in-between layers, and that saved me from taking out a bunch of stitches. So the first part of that tip is be aware of where your knots are so you're not stitching through them and making a mess. But if you do happen to get into that kind of mess, if you wrap a thread around it a couple of times and pull it, use that thread to pull it through with the needle, it can help bury it again. And this one I'll also just describe to you. I've mentioned that I like to use a tapestry needle, a blunt tapestry needle, sometimes to pull out basting thread. Well, I also use it exclusively if I've done a bunch of stitching and then I want to pull it all out to go back to fix something, and then still use that thread to go again or tie it off. If I've used a seam ripper, the seam ripper can cut the thread more often than not, and then your thread gets even shorter, and then you have to take more stitches out. So the blunt needle guards against that. It won't cut your thread. It'll just nicely, because it's blunt, go under the thread, and then is strong enough to pull it out. And my final piece for today, and thank you for watching the whole video because you get a bonus, I'm going to reveal the fabric that's inspiring next month's colors. Here it is. I have this piece. I love these stack of teacups. So the colors for February are going to be blue and yellow. See you then.